Well, I guess kind of what I'd like to do is to review over the things that we talked about, and talking about, I guess, as part of what this process was and was designed for. We started off by saying that language is one of those things that makes human beings unique. I think language is one of those things that allows us to be creative, and also, I think, as some of you found, language can be limiting as well. Our question is, what are the structures of language that can limit us or that can empower us? I don't think that language is just words. I think that language is its own form of reality. And I think that some of the things you experienced also tend to confirm that. In The Structure of Magic, Volume 1, Grinder and Bandler said that the language was a model of the world. Not just a way of describing a model, but in and of itself, it can become a model of the world. And I think in the same way that a set of words can have a reality that is powerful enough to influence you, even though it doesn't fit with what you see or what you feel, is a statement to that fact. And that language, since it's in a way... Oh, is it not on? Yeah, it's on. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Language, in a way... Thank you. Since it is the most evolutionary recent, is also in some ways the part of our experience that we least understand. And while in a lot of the other NLP courses you learn how to change your visual submodalities and you learn sensory observational skills, which I think are incredibly important and that are going to be an extremely useful and important tool to make sure that you balance your sleight of mouth. Using sleight of mouth in and of itself will get you nowhere, except into arguments. However, using language in addition with the other powerful tools that you have in terms of observing is going to be very important. And what we wanted to do is to identify some of the structure of how language worked, how it gets its power, as its own reality. Sort of saying that language doesn't have to be logical. It doesn't have to fit with what you see, and it can still be powerful. The ways in which we explored that were how language can create meanings by creating categories. In my own personal experience, I remember a time when John Grinder, one of the early classes that I went to, I was talking about how I walked into this class 12 years ago. One of the assignments that he gave in the next class that I had with him was one that I will not forget. It was an assignment where he said, find something that you've never really paid much attention to before, and name it. And notice how it changes your perception. Just make up a name for it, and notice how it changes your perception. And in going up and talking to him afterwards, I was saying, well, what kind of things would you, are you interested in, or, we're just kind of talking about it. At a certain point, my eyes shifted over into the left, and he said, well, what about that? And I said, what? He said, your eyes just went over. Your eyes just moved. I said, tried to figure out, well, what was going on. And I kind of felt that I'd gone inside, almost into a little trance state. So I kind of named it minimal cues, trance cues, of how people put themselves, anchored themselves into a little bit of a trance. And began to go out, and suddenly the most amazing thing happened. It was like scales fell from my eyes. And there I was, sort of seeing this whole world in front of me that had always been there. I never noticed it until I gave it a name. And that information, incidentally, later developed into what is known as the NLP eye movements, NLP accessing cues. Back in those days, I was just noticing everything that people did. That snap their fingers, tap their head, click their tongues, blink their eyes. It gave me a lot of wonderful things to do in classes where if I was getting bored, I could go and look at people and notice that somebody would be listening to the teacher, and you could see how big of a chunk of information they were taking in by their eye blinks. So the person would be sitting there and the guy would be talking, chunk, chunk, and the teacher would make a mistake or stumble upon a word, and the person would go, chunk, chunk. And you could actually watch how much of a chunk of information a person was storing by how fast they blinked their eyes. Anyway, the whole world opened up to me. And I said, well, that's a pretty interesting thing. That's the power of modeling, the power of the word, the power of language. However, as we also know, that language can categorize things in ways that limit us, in ways that reduce our experience as opposed to enrich it and empower it. So what we've been exploring here is, what are the ways? I like the fact that some of you said you could have permission to use these. Language is not the word in the sense of, it's something that you have to respond to, that you can't speak back, and have creative, and as Edmund said, both respectful as well as humorous, charming, and intelligent tools by which you can respond to things that people say that allow you to open up the belief, not to make them wrong, nor to give in. And that's what meta is all about. And the kind of things that we explored were chains of meaning, chains of causes, and how causes can get set up with language. One of the things that many of the philosophers pointed out is that cause and effect is not really something that you can observe in the world. You notice that two things happen near each other, but cause and effect is a complete human construction. You really can't tell that something really caused something else. You can't observe it. All you can see is that two events happened in the same space and time, and cause is actually something that we put to it, which I think is a very powerful sort of way of thinking of what language can do. When I say this causes that, I've suddenly made a reality. We also talked about comparing. Comparisons to what? Rich compared to what? We talked about the kind of levels of experience, that language can appeal to these different levels of being, whether it's specific behaviors, capabilities, identities. We've gone over some specific patterns for how to accomplish some of the kind of empowering changes or option-opening changes. The fact that a number of you mentioned humor, I think, is good, because humor is a state that occurs when suddenly you learn something. One of the most fascinating things I remember about watching Moshe Feldenkrais's work was that he pointed out that when people really learned something, like if I remember seeing a video where he was working with a child, this is the interesting thing about beliefs, who had cerebral palsy, and his legs were being pulled together, like, they rubbed together, and he couldn't walk very well. 3 different surgeons had told the parents that the only way to deal with that, the only way for him to walk without damaging his legs, would be to cut the adductor muscles on his legs, which would then make them, of course, they would atrophy and become useless. So he would lose something. Within 20 minutes, confusion of the same logical type, actually. Feldenkrais had this young man walking with his legs open, just by touching and moving and kind of doing a kinesthetic sleight of mouth, I would call it. And one of the things that happened, there was a certain point when all of a sudden that child started laughing. And you knew that he'd suddenly figured something out that he didn't know. And Feldenkrais said, that's right, you should laugh when you learn something important. That's the state that you want to attach to it. And I think in a way, humor and the whole idea of beliefs fitting in with humor and moving around there is something that's really important. So we learned some things about going to consequences, intentions, applying to self, metaframes, the various kinds of places that you can go to respond or frame a belief. Now, in doing this kind of work, I have a little metaphor I'd like to kind of give you at the end of this program. I have a couple of things I'd like to say, but first one is a metaphor about a young fellow who was learning drafting. And he went to study drafting, and he had this drafting was something that was really important to him, because he felt that drafting was one of those things that was kind of an expression of what was really fully creative in people. For example, you took something that was a dream, a complete idea in somebody's mind, had no physical existence whatsoever, and you represented it. You made a map out of it. And from that map, somebody could actually take that and make and manifest that thing in the world. And I believe all map-making functions are that way. So as an aside here, I believe that NLP is not a bunch of techniques for communication. NLP is tools for dreamers. NLP is tools that allow you to take things that are just conceptions and forge them into a map that allows you to manifest them physically in the world. That's what creativity and genius is all about, in my opinion. And this young fellow was able, he got that, and he really was he had so many dreams that he wanted to manifest in terms of the kind of things that he saw in his mind. And so he went and he learned in this class, and he learned all about things like how important it was, if you're going to build a house, to have a good map. The map needed to represent things not only in the small details, but it needed to represent the whole picture. That you needed to be able to look at that house from the front and the top and the side and without the roof on it and see the schematics. That there was a whole lot of ways which to look at this particular thing in order to manifest it, to make it real. You couldn't just look at it from one point of view and have somebody build it. That reality was representing things from a lot of different perspectives. He also learned that once you have the map, you need to have a good construction crew. You can have the best plans in the world, but if you have an incompetent crew or people that are not trained, then there's going to be problems. He also learned that not only do you need a good construction crew and a good map, but you had to have good materials to work with. You could have a wonderful construction crew, people that were very capable. You could have a wonderful map, but if you use poor materials, that building would be weak, no matter how good the people were or the map was. And also, that the environment was important. If you, as the people in Los Angeles learned, you could build a wonderful building right on a fault line, and the world will find fault with your construction. And so he learned about all of these things, and he realized the relationships of how to put all of those things together to design. And all the different perspectives, the different issues, the different elements. And when it came at the end of that class, for him to take his final, he was so excited. He built the biggest dream that he had, and he wanted to really show his thing of so much that he learned. Problem was, when he sat down, class started, it was time for him to do the test. He kind of looked at the paper, and all these ideas came rushing in, the different perspectives, the environment, the crew, the materials, all the different things. These little chunks came shooting out at the same time, and he basically went blank. The teacher came by, and having noticed this person staring blankly at his paper for 5 minutes, said, can I help you? The young fellow tried to explain, I have all these ideas running. I do know the material. It's so important to me. I want to be able to express myself. Well, the teacher just kind of looked at him for a moment and said, well, went over to his paper, picked up his pencil, and drew a square in the middle of his paper and said, what about that? The fellow said, well, you can't have a square. First of all, the idea for the building I had wasn't square. It had a couple of wings, and this was rounded, and this needed this kind of thing. And of course, if you look at it from this angle, and of course, within a few moments, all of the information was beginning to pour out onto the paper. And I think that that's a very important principle to keep in mind for yourself. If you're going to work with beliefs, you're going to work with people. The goal is not to have all this information and try and manifest it. The goal is to have that all as a background, as a structure, and to take the simplest step possible at first. As Albert Einstein said, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not any simpler. And so you start with the most simplest possible maneuver, and people will let you know. If you have feedback, they'll let you know. It's one of the things you might want to use as you learn to apply these things. My goal here is not necessarily been able to give you a complete cognitive understanding of all the definitions of sleight of mouth. It's been to provide a structure by which you can build your own intuitions. And when you work, I recommend that you work intuitively. The structures are there to build intuitions, not to substitute for them. Second thing about beliefs is one of my favorite stories is about Albert Einstein, where somebody asked him, they said, well, Dr. Einstein, you've probably one of the most bona fide geniuses of our century. Your span of thought has encompassed everything from the atom to the entire cosmos. You're a humanitarian, a scientist, a great thinker. What is the most important question do you think is facing humanity today? And Einstein kind of looked off up into space for a moment, and then he looked down at the ground in front of him. Big chunks, little chunks, what can I say? And he looked back at the reporter and said, I think the most important question facing humanity is the universe a friendly place? That belief is the most important one to start from. If we believe that the universe is an unfriendly place, then we're going to use our knowledge, We're going to use our map-making abilities. We're going to use our technology to create tools that destroy and wall out that unfriendliness. If you believe that the universe is just a chaos, that it's neither friendly nor unfriendly, then you're a victim to the toss of the dice. There's no meaning. I mean, you're just kind of getting by, and you have a random existence. It doesn't matter what you do, what your tools are. If, on the other hand, you believe that the universe is a friendly place, then what you're going to find is that you'll be using your maps, your technologies, your knowledge to create tools for understanding that universe, because it's through understanding it, understanding the structure, that you will have safety and power. So believing that it's friendly doesn't mean you're automatically safe. You do need power. You do need to protect yourself. But if you believe it's friendly, understanding will come through protection. Protection will come through understanding, both. And I kind of, at the end of a program like this, I think it's sort of important. I have some of my own personal, kind of a personal thing that, and we talk about sleight of mouth and reality this and reality that. And I know in myself, the idea of beliefs and the idea of having some of these levels to go to respond to is very important. Many of you know I work with beliefs in health. And a number of you know, either from seeing the tape or hearing me talk about it, that my mother had cancer, a recurrence of breast cancer about 5 years ago, and we had a very poor prognosis and all that, but was able to, basically, at this point today, she's in complete remission, and without the use of chemotherapy, drugs, or radiation, that kind of thing. And I think it was very powerful. It was sort of the start of what got me into thinking about beliefs, certainly in terms of beliefs in health, and some of the kind of things that we've explored here, those kinds of changes of perception. Another story that I haven't really told very much, but I think it's equally as important, is about my father. And we're kind of talking about parents. And about 2 years ago, my father suffered a major stroke. He'd been working on making a lot of changes in himself. He'd smoked for a number of years and quit smoking, was losing weight, was finally, he'd talk about being successful in business. He was a patent attorney, he'd always worked for other people, and had just finished the most successful year of his life, and suddenly had a major stroke. And I found out about it and went to the hospital, and they didn't expect him to make it through the day. I mean, his whole right side of his body was completely paralyzed, blind. They didn't think that he was conscious. And we all got in there, and I tried all the various things, pacing and leading and using beliefs, and he survived the first day. And they thought it was a miracle. It's quite interesting. But the particular kind of issue that he had was when you have that big of a stroke, your body tries to heal it. And the paradox is that when it tries to heal it, it starts to swell. Swelling is a part of healing. The problem with your brain is that since it's inside of a nice bony box there that doesn't stretch, when you swell, your skin swells, but your brain, your skull doesn't do that. So it starts to push your brain down through, as you swells, pushes it down through your bottom part of your skull, which makes all kinds of terrible things happen. Your body doesn't regulate right anymore, and all kinds of things. Anyway, to make an interesting but long story short, after 4 or 5 days of being up all night, trying everything I could think of, and working, there came a point where we wanted to be able to get some kind of a sign from my father that he was conscious, because they kept kind of saying, well, he's not paying any attention. An interesting thing happened. All of a sudden, in asking, my sister and my mother and I were there, all of a sudden he reached out with his left hand, because he couldn't, his right side was completely paralyzed, and he had some movement in his left, and he grabbed me behind the head and pulled me down to his ear, pulled my ear down to his mouth, and he said something. I thought it was hi. In retrospect, it might have been bye. I don't know. But then, in the situation where, this was a man that was, my father was a big man. He wasn't like me in the stature, in a sense. He was a barrel-chested person, a huge person. Here he was, his bodily functions were so impaired, he couldn't urinate on his own. He was blind, or supposedly unconscious. Began to feel around with his left hand. and he grabbed my sister's hand. He couldn't see. I mean, completely, his body is just a shell. And he put that on top of his hand. And then he reached around and he grabbed my mother's hand. And he put that on top of her hand. He grabbed my hand and he put that on top of his. And he put his on top of all of them. And that was basically the last conscious act that he had before his brain died, basically. And, and when you get down to these questions of is the universe a friendly place or not, we did have to decide, well, do you keep them on life support or not? And that's where I tell you that you're not going to be able to look in your checkbook and decide, well, should we let this, should we keep this life support apparatus on or not? You're not going to be able to look to somebody's accessing cues or representational systems. There's only one place you're going to go, and that's going to be to what you believe about the world. And this is where you find that those questions about is the universe a friendly place is something that's not just sleight of mouth. It's something that is going to resonate all through you and through the universe, if you want to speak that way. And we did decide to take the apparatus off, and they were afraid that maybe he would keep living, kind of thing. However, he died quite peacefully. And when I think about it, and I think about, and beliefs in health and all of this stuff, what you wonder, okay, is the universe a friendly place? Is this a tragedy? What is this? And for my own part, and I think reason I'm telling this story is about the beliefs, and it's obviously a really personal thing for me, but when I think about what I would like to do and the kind of person I'd like to be, and what I'd like to use my belief skills or my NLP skills or all the things that I've learned in life, if I had the guts and the presence of mind and the ability to do what he did in the last moment of my life, with my body broken and my consciousness basically all but gone, that would make it all worth it. If I could use my NLP to be able to do that, that would make it worth it to me. And that's the kind of thing I think about when I think about what is the what to be able to kind of draw into the deepest places inside of you and do that. And in that way, I think regarding beliefs, some of the most important things that I've learned in life learned a lot of things from my mother by her living, and a lot of things from my father by his dying. And when it comes down to beliefs, I think that those are some of the kind of issues that are important to address. And as you take your tools of sleight of mouth and you think about beliefs, what they mean in terms of words, what they mean in terms of your lives, I think that you might find, and I hope that maybe you find someday that some belief thing that you've learned here or some structure or some understanding can help provide you with a way to utilize, to accept, to deal with situations like that and to learn from them in the most full ways that are possible for you. I want to thank you for all your participation in this. Sleight of mouth is one of those things that's not it's not completely structured like teaching six-step reframing, so it involves a lot of work on your part, and I appreciate you being willing to put out that effort. And I hope that you get back in full proportion the amount of effort that you put into this in terms of results and learning and changes for yourselves. So on that, I'd like to say thank you and good night, and may we meet again.